como dijo Abraham Lincoln, ¿qué es la democracia? La democracia no es un sistema a través del cual una élite enriquecida explota a la mayoría empobrecida. No, la democracia debe ser, dijo Abraham Lincoln, gobierno del pueblo, gobierno por el pueblo y gobierno para el pueblo. A eso dedico yo y dedicaré todos los días de mi vida.
Hugo Chavez was born July 28, 1954, in Sabaneta, Barinas, Venezuela. He was a Venezuelan politician who was president of Venezuela from 1999 to 2013. Chavez styled himself as the leader of the Bolivarian Revolution, a socialist political program for much of Latin America named after Simón Bolívar, the South American independence hero. Chavez's goals included nationalism, a centralized economy, and a solid military. This belief system became known to many as Chavismo.
Chavez's political movement, Chavismo, was based on redistributing Venezuela's oil wealth into social programs. His policies were popular with the country's poor, less so with the wealthy.
The upper classes, even the better off middle class people hated Chavez. He was, in their view, ruining the country and destroying the economy. When Chavez first came to power, oil was at roughly $7 to $9 a barrel. But by 2004, 2005, we're looking at oil price per barrel lifting over $100 a barrel.
He has power and he has money. And so he decides new forms of social policies that can distribute the oil revenues in a more massive way downwards towards those that more need it, toward the poor.
The key moment in his presidency came in 2004 when oil prices surged. Venezuela's petroleum-dependent economy started booming, and Chavez went on to spend billions from the profits on social welfare programs for the poor. He subsidized food, improved the educational system, built an enviable healthcare system, and reduced poverty by more than half. These programs certainly helped the poor, but they served a purpose for Chavez as well. In order to be re-elected, he needed to keep these millions of poor Venezuelans happy.
Venezuela's economy was booming at the height of Chavez's presidency due to high oil prices, making it easy for him to please his lower-class following with socialist programs. Foreign investors viewed the country as a credit-worthy option for lending, as they would have no difficulty making interest payments. The Venezuelan government borrowed billions of dollars to help fund Chavez's different social programs.
And Cuba came up with a bunch of new social programs, massive new social programs for healthcare, for access to food, and for scholarships.
We have a whole raft of these so-called misiones, the social programs, which give people citizenship rights, identity cards, access to job training, access to breakfast clubs, university systems. So this is a very comprehensive effort to deliver basic social services.
What this is doing, though, is essentially still using oil as that redemptive quality to bring social change, while bringing social change, deepening the dependence on oil, and he can do this while the prices of oil are high.
The whole strategy of Chavismo initially was about diversification of the economy, reducing Venezuela's vulnerability to oil price bust. And in the initial Chavista model, this was hinged very much around processes of land reform, trying to reduce Venezuela's dependence on agricultural imports and food imports. What happens after the presidential elections of 2006 is that Chavez is bringing oil straight back into the center of Venezuela's economic model.
He had a high price of oil, and he had access to finance. He could borrow as if it was going out of fashion. So he decided that that was the moment to radicalize the process.
As oil prices went up, Venezuela spent it all. They didn't set any money aside in a sovereign wealth fund and a rainy day fund. So they've got money in case things go down. Everybody in the oil industry knows oil prices are cyclical.
Chavez gets sick. He gets cancer. Meanwhile, many things began to unravel.
Capital markets said, these guys are borrowing as if it was going out of fashion. So they sort of started to stop lending to the country.
The economy starts to go down. People begin to say, wait a minute, before it's all gone, I'm going to get my piece of it.
Now, when Chavez had first come to power, he had said that essentially there was going to be a hard hand, an iron fist against these problems of corruption. But the reality was that absolutely nothing was done. So the end result is kind of decay of the Chavista Bolivarian revolution and a state which is becoming more and more indebted.
The biggest sucker in Venezuelan history is the guy who's going to follow Chavez as president. And that's exactly what happened.
Venezuela was once the richest country in Latin America. It has the largest known oil reserves in the world, and its democratic government was once praised worldwide. But today, Venezuela's democratic institutions and its economy are in shambles. The country has the highest inflation rate in the world, making food and medicine inaccessible to most Venezuelans. Over the last 4 years, its GDP has fallen 35%, which is a sharper drop than the one seen during the Great Depression in the US. And the country's murder rate has surpassed that of the most dangerous cities in the world. These conditions have sparked months of protests against the president, Nicolas Maduro, and it's easy to see why. The country has become measurably worse since his election in 2013.
Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro has been declared winner of Sunday's election. 14 Latin American countries do not recognize the result. Paula Newton joins us from Caracas. Paula, look, I'm just going to ask you straight out because, I'm guessing there was no element of free and fair about this election.
Well, certainly the government says the entire electoral process is free and fair. Obviously, you have not just those Latin American countries, but also the United States coming out strongly and saying that these elections were neither free nor fair. But also, Richard, they were entirely underwhelming this time, and that's all you have to look at. The turnout was less than 50%. If it was even that high, I'm not convinced. I've covered many Venezuelan elections. It was quiet. What was replicated on social media and in other media organizations was the fact that there was hardly anyone at the polls. Why? There was a lot of apathy from people here, many believing that the election wouldn't change much, especially in their own personal lives. But also, Richard, there is that question of intimidation. And, last year we were here covering raucous disputes in the streets, protests, people really putting their lives on the line to really tell the Maduro regime exactly what they thought of their government. This year, nothing. The intelligence services have done what they can do to intimidate these people into staying silent, and that has been the complexion of this election that we've seen so far. I want you to listen now, though.
A poll showed that about 80% of Venezuelans want Maduro removed from office. But instead, the opposite has happened. Maduro has consolidated his power, bringing the country closer to authoritarian rule. Maduro's political ambition became evident in December 2015. 2 years after he became president, a coalition of opposition parties called the Democratic Unity Roundtable, or MUD, won a two-thirds majority in the National Assembly, putting Maduro's rule at risk. In response, Maduro quickly forced out several Supreme Court justices and filled the positions with cronies loyal to him. In March 2016, the court ruled to strip the opposition-led National Assembly of its powers, a move that sparked massive protests across the country. The ruling was reversed a few days later, but the damage was done. Protests continued to grow and have left about 100 dead and thousands injured so far. Despite the violence and public outcry, Maduro held a vote in July to elect a new governing body called the National Constituent Assembly, which would have the power to rewrite Venezuela's constitution and essentially replace the National Assembly, and leave virtually no opposition to Maduro's rule.
¿Por qué está saliendo a votar hoy?
Bueno, por el bienestar del país.
¿Qué está buscando en esta nueva Asamblea Nacional Constituyente?
Bueno, una paz para todos.
And gas masks, pick up their slingshots and homemade shields, and head into the streets to fight the government.
Esto significa, primero que todo, esto es una rebelión contra el gobierno. Y mayormente yo vengo acá es para poder agregar, ganar un poquito, un granito de arena para derrocar este gobierno.
These daily protests in Caracas normally begin as peaceful marches of tens of thousands of people. Residents who are angry about the government of President Nicolas Maduro and the severe economic crisis in the country.
Yo pienso que cada vez que salen y nos reprimen es porque les da miedo que la gente salga y diga lo que piensa, porque se acabó la libertad y por eso es que seguimos saliendo.
But it doesn't take very long before Venezuelan soldiers and police block the protest route, and then the violence begins. On the government side, security forces shoot water cannons and fire tear gas canisters at the protesters, as well as marbles, rubber bullets, or other projectiles. Protesters throw Molotov cocktails, rocks, and shoot fireworks. So far, about 60 people have been killed, with hundreds more injured. The protests began after Maduro tried to nullify the Congress here. He is currently trying to change the Constitution, but there is also a general sense of rage and frustration at the lack of food and medicine, the rampant inflation. Protesters say they are not going to stop going out into the streets until the Venezuelan government falls.
Due to the government's lack of solutions, the citizens have become violent and caused civil unrest. The government cannot borrow any financial assistance because they are in too much debt. The top holders of their debt are Wall Street lenders such as Fidelity Investments, T. Rowe Price, BlackRock Shares, Goldman Sachs, and Invesco Power Shares. Venezuela has defaulted on interest payments numerous times and ruined their credibility to get financial assistance from other countries.
Getting groceries in Venezuela is almost as hard as getting debt payments, the cynics might say, though China apparently isn't among them.
We believe that Venezuela's government and people have the ability to properly handle their debt issue. We hope all parties can resolve this issue via consultation.
Another ally of Venezuela's socialist government stepped up with support on Wednesday. Russia, according to this announcement, agreeing to restructure $3 billion in debt over 10 years. Venezuela is now in default, according to S&P, but President Nicolas Maduro's government may now have some room to maneuver as creditor demands mount.
Most people in the market are describing it as a nightmare. What is fascinating is the fact that Russia, which is owed some $8 billion, and China, which is owed some $28 billion, are both facing potentially enormous losses from a defaulted Venezuela.
Those losses might be offset by oil shipments from the OPEC member, though late interest payments by its state oil company have also spooked markets. Venezuela says it started paying $200 million in overdue interest on some of its $60 billion of outstanding bonds. But its political crisis is ongoing too, amid new sanctions from the US and the EU.
With US sanctions against Venezuela already in place, President Trump now says he may be willing to take things further.
We have many options for Venezuela. This is our neighbor. This is, we're all over the world. And we have troops all over the world in places that are very, very far away. Venezuela is not very far away, and the people are suffering, and they're dying. We have many options for Venezuela, including a possible military option if necessary.
Venezuela's government has already dismissed Trump's words as imperial threats and a crazy act. But one former diplomat says it's a threat that should be taken seriously.
This is not a drill. It is a warning bell for Maduro's regime to capitulate and free Venezuela. The Venezuelan people have suffered enough, and it's time for Maduro to free Venezuela from his tyranny.